Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and we now turn to a text that is somewhat contiguous to the Gettysburg Address in your hymnal. I'm with you on page 540, 541. We're going to talk for a few moments about Robert E. Lee, and more particularly a letter that he wrote to his son on the 23rd of January, 1861. We've spoken about the crises of the American Civil War from a multiple number of perspectives, but one we have not spoken about that we will now talk about in for your notes is the challenge of loyalty. I would write it down as that at level 1. The challenge of loyalty. As the American Civil War is about to begin, there is huge debate about which side of the argument you're on. Before the actual contests, the early battles, the Battle of Bull Run and the beginning of the American Civil War, the United States has an army that is led by a number of brilliant minds. The most brilliant of those minds, General Robert E. Lee. Brilliant tactician, brilliant soldier, unbelievable courage. The challenge for Lee happens that he is going to have to make a decision, and I would write it down as that at level 1. Lee must make a decision. Here is his problem. Let's outline it before we listen to his comments to his son. On the one hand, he is very much in favor of and a believer in the Constitution. He believes in the Union and the Constitution. In other words, he is through and through a patriot. That's his first challenge. He believes in the country. He is aware, for example, of the greatest general, Washington, and the American Revolution, which led to the founding of America. He is acutely aware and loyal to Jefferson, who in 1776 will write that famous document that we call today, of course, the Declaration of Independence. Lee, very much about all of that. So on the one hand, that's where his loyalties lie. Okay? On the other hand, he comes from Virginia. I would write that down. He comes from Virginia. Virginia is his home state. And his loyalties lie deeply to Virginia as well. Whoa! So now he has a serious problem. What happens if Virginia decides to secede from the Union? Which side will he be on? I would write it down that way. Which side will he be on? Will he be on the side of America, the Union, and the Constitution? Or will he be on the side of the state to which he belongs, Virginia, the place he lived in, grew up in, all of his loyalties lie there, his family lives there? What happens if Virginia says, we are seceding from the Union to the top general? What does he do? Does he say to his state, I'm sorry, but I have to stay with the Constitution? And the obvious question is, really? Well, where are you going to live? Because you live in Virginia and we are seceding from that union. Where's your family going to live? Who will you go home to? Because your home is in Virginia. And Virginia is about to secede from the Union. It doesn't belong to America anymore. Are you going to leave your family and your home? Or are you going to be on the side of your state and your new country, the Confederacy? Oh yeah, and by the way, we're probably going to have to fight, which means you're going to have to lead those troops. If you don't lead our troops, you're going to be leading the troops of the North against your own people? Whoa, I would write that down. See, that really becomes, it's not just a political choice for Lee. He has to make a fundamental choice about loyalties That's personal. It's family. It's loyalties to soldiers. Let's point out that everything I just said about Lee is true for thousands of American soldier men and women who have to find some answer to the question, which side are you on? Now, very quickly, before we even read this text, you could jump to 3b, and you could ask yourself in your own recollection, in your own memory, when was the last time that you had to make a choice where both sides were right? Were you affiliated with both sides? You had allegiances to both sides. It might be, for example, in a family dynamic where you love both parties. You have loyalties going both ways. And you have somebody saying to you, make a choice. But you realize there's no good choice. There's no quote-unquote right choice. On both sides, you see the arguments. Lee saw the arguments of the North, the Union, that said, hey, we got a constitution. When we have to work things out, we work it out through the court of law, and that's the end of it. And the Constitution is what we stand by. That's what makes us the United States of America. So this secession thing is not united. That's divided. That's bad news. But on the other side, you have people saying to him, wait a minute, doesn't Virginia have a right to do what it should do for its own economic survival? Namely, retaining its slaves. We ought to have our own rights. The government shouldn't be able to tell us what to do. And if they try to tell us what to do in this, we have to go to war and fight for our rights. Don't you believe in that? Lee, stuck in the middle. Sometimes we call this stuck between a rock and a hard place. But let's go to 3a really quickly and make a reference to a famous literary story. This is an allusion, a reference, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N, an allusion to a famous story, one that you're probably familiar with if you studied in your freshman year, Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus, the great warrior, is leading his troops, and he is told, you have to go through a special place where on one side you're going to have a really bad monster, Scylla. On the other side you're going to have another really bad monster, Charybdis. And you have to navigate your ship through both of them. And guess what? Both monsters are going to end up jacking you. And guess what? There's no way around. You have to go through it. In other words, we will look at this short passage as a representation of what it means when you have to go through an experience where there is no right answer, where on both sides you agree and yet both sides are in conflict in such a way that you're stuck in the middle and there is no, are you ready for this? There's no third option for Lee. There's no third option. There's no walking away or saying, hey, let's sit down and compromise. When finally it happens, and see, some of you are thinking already at 3b, I have been in this situation with a friendship or two, where, for example, I'm friends with both people, but those two people are fighting it out, and they are both looking to me to say, which side are you on? They're texting you saying, what should you, you're with me on this, right? And both sides, and you're like, hey, look, I'm with both of you. But the problem is, you have to choose. There's no third option. Let's listen now to Lee's comments to his son, January, just about 100 days before the actual war will begin. Lee is asking himself, and of course his family as well, what is the right thing to do? I don't know what the right thing to do is. I'm with you now on page 541. Notice that on page 540, right below this picture of Robert E. Lee, notice the quote, do your duty in all things. You cannot do more. You should never wish to do less. That is a significant line. I would write it down at level 1. And of course, the important word is the word duty. Not what you want to do, but what you have to do. I'll define it again for you. Duty. Not what you want to do, but what you have to do. And again, at 3b, we could ask this question, when was the last time in your life you had to do something that you would qualify as your duty, not your desire? Let's not confuse the two. Duty is often not your desire. It's often your obligation. It's what you have to do, even if you don't want to do it. And Lee is stuck. Lee is so great that Ulysses S. Grant, the greatest general of the Northern troops, will say about him, "There was not a man in the Confederacy whose influence with the whole people was as great as Lee's." Whoa. So there's the compliment of all compliments. Future President Ulysses S. Grant is going to say about Robert E. Lee, he was the man of all men. Tremendous respect for this guy. And everyone was watching to ask, what will he do? Which side will he choose? He could have chosen to be a general of the Union of the North. Let's listen to now what he has to say to his boy. Just take a few moments now to read this with our professional reader. Again, work hard to follow the words, every word, to see how well you're able to read what he has to say. Hear the pain in his voice as he writes to his son about the choice he has to make. This will not be an easy one. Amazing American history here you're about to get a little picture into.
To his son, by Robert E. Lee. January 23rd, 1861. I received Everett's Life of Washington, which you sent me, and enjoyed its perusal. How his spirit would be grieved could he see the wreck of his mighty labors. I will not, however, permit myself to believe, until all ground of hope is gone, that the fruit of his noble deeds will be destroyed, and that his precious advice and virtuous example will so soon be forgotten by his countrymen. As far as I can judge by the papers, we are between a state of anarchy and civil war. May God avert both of these evils from us. I fear that mankind will not for years be sufficiently Christianized to bear the absence of restraint and force. I see that 4 states have declared themselves out of the Union. 4 more will apparently follow their example. Then, if the border states are brought into the Gulf of Revolution, 1/2 of the country will be arrayed against the other. I must try and be patient and await the end, for I can do nothing to hasten or retard it. The South, in my opinion, has been aggrieved by the acts of the North, as you say. I feel the aggression, and am willing to take every proper step for redress. It is the principle I contend for, not individual or private benefit. As an American citizen, I take great pride in my country, her prosperity and institutions, and would defend any state if her rights were invaded. But I can anticipate no greater calamity for the country than a dissolution of the Union. It would be an accumulation of all the evils we complain of, and I am willing to sacrifice everything but honor for its preservation. I hope, therefore, that all constitutional means will be exhausted before there is a resort to force. Secession is nothing but revolution. The framers of our Constitution never exhausted so much labor, wisdom, and forbearance in its formation, and surrounded it with so many guards and securities, if it was intended to be broken by every member of the Confederacy at will. It was intended for perpetual union, so expressed in the preamble, and for the establishment of a government, not a compact, which can only be dissolved by revolution, or the consent of all the people in convention assembled. It is idle to talk of secession. Anarchy would have been established, and not a government, by Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and the other patriots of the Revolution. Still, a union that can only be maintained by swords and bayonets, and in which strife and civil war are to take the place of brotherly love and kindness, has no charm for me. I shall mourn for my country and for the welfare and progress of mankind. If the Union is dissolved and the government disrupted, I shall return to my native state and share the miseries of my people. And save in defense, will draw my sword on none.
Now, this is a fascinating insight 100 days before the beginning of the end. Notice here you have a man who, very much like Lincoln in 63 at Gettysburg, notice opening lines will say, Washington would be doing one of these right now. General Washington, George Washington, he'd be doing one of these going, man, I cannot believe you guys let this thing get this far down the road. Notice what he considers are the two options. Let's work now at level 1 and 2A. Notice what he considers are the two options. On the one hand, you have the Union, America. On the other hand, you have revolution. Notice he points out that when the framers of the Constitution wrote the Constitution, they didn't write it as some kind of a compact, but rather as a government that will be perpetual. In other words, you don't get rid of it. Here was the question for those of the South. Do we follow Jefferson's model if we feel like the North is starting to behave like old England did back in the American Revolution? If the North is starting to act kind of like England and George III, we have a moral duty to fight against that, therefore revolution. Notice then that Lee will begin by saying to his son, I don't think Washington would be very pleased at all with what we're watching happen. The second thing we want to point out at level 1 is notice that Lee believes still, 100 days before the beginning of the Civil War, still believes there is a peaceful compromise for this situation. Somehow we can figure it out. Already 4 states have gone, right? You'll see in your footnote there on page 541, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama had already seceded from the Union. 4 were soon to follow, and it was going to be those border states, those Gulf states, that would then have to make the decision. In this case, of course, Virginia being one of them. Notice how in the very end of his letter, he says, no greater calamity, top of page 542, no greater calamity for the country could happen than the dissolution of the Union. It would be an accumulation of all the evils we complain of, and I am willing, whoa, are you reading this with me? Top of page 542. I am willing to sacrifice everything but honor for its preservation. Now, what does that mean? Let's jot down now at 2A what it is he's really saying. He is saying, I will not get involved in this fight unless it's about my honor. Now, I would write that phrase down, and we'll come to it here in a moment at 3B and ask, what does it mean to say your honor has been challenged? The real question, of course, is, what is a justifiable fight or a justifiable war? This becomes a very important idea in the history of thought. What constitutes a legitimate fight, a legitimate war? When are you right to not turn the other cheek? When are you right to fight? Right? What's the right time to know how to do that? Let's jot down a couple themes messages here at 2A. Obviously here, one of the primary questions is the issue of just war. When is it the right thing to do? Number 2, the obvious other question is, you have precedence that's about to be set here. George Washington is looking down, Jefferson is looking down, the rest of the founding fathers looking down, Lee says, on us, and Lee says they would not be pleased with what it is we're doing here. Finally, notice how he ends his letter to his boy. He says that if things can't be worked out, last 2 lines, I'm on page 542, I'll return to my native state, Virginia, and share the miseries of my people and save in defense. Only if somebody attacks me will I draw my sword on none. Whoa. Now this is significant. Lee, before the war begins, says, I will not be an active participant in this. I will go back to my home, and what happens, happens. They attack my house, I will fight. But beyond that, no. Obviously, a study of history will say, what changed Lee's mind the 100 days after he wrote this letter? And the answer to that, of course, is He saw it as inevitable that his home would be attacked in the matter of war, and therefore it was a battle for him of both defense more than it was offense, but certainly an offensive war as well. Lee will make it through all 4 years of the American Civil War, and in the end, it will be Lee who has to say, "We are done. It is over." He will live an amazing 2 lives. Many have talked about his 2 lives. The first life was the life that you're reading right now, the life before the war. The second was the life of the war and after the war. And it broke his heart. It really did. It broke his heart that he ended up having to do this. Let's jump to 2B really quickly. Very simple. Let's just talk about this as the form of a letter. Notice that he's writing to his son who sent him a book on Washington, and clearly they've been exchanging ideas back and forth about what it means to go to war, to have a civil war. Also point out here that you have a person thinking out loud in his writing about how it is that he will make his choice, right? On what grounds will he make his choice? This is the old head versus heart dilemma. Think about the last time you had to make a tough choice. Are you a person that kind of works off of your head and you kind of make lists to decide, or are you more an emotional person? How would you jot down at 2B, how would you qualify Lee here? Do you see him as predominantly an emotional guy, or do you see him as more rational kind of guy, the guy that uses his mind, right? Okay. So for example, I've often had this conversation, especially, not always, but mostly with boys that were in high school. You're walking down the hall, somebody walks past you, boom, hits you in the shoulder and knocks you. And for a split moment, you and the person who walked into your shoulder